Section 31 of Life and Gabriella by Ellen Glasgow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2nd, The Age of Knowledge. Chapter 9, The Past. Part 1. It was the morning of Gabriella's 38th birthday, and she was standing with her hat on before the window of her sitting room, gazing with dreaming eyes at the young leaves on the elm tree. The day's work was ahead of her, but for a little while, standing there by the open window, she gave herself, with a sense of pleasure, of abandonment, to the rare luxury of regret. Out of her whole year it was the one day when, for a few hours, she permitted herself to think sadly of the past and the future, when she cherished in her heart something of the gentle melancholy of her mother's retrospective philosophy. In the street beyond the narrow yard, where the grass lay like a veil, there was a curious deadening of sounds, as if the traffic had become suddenly muffled in the languorous softness of spring. Out of this imaginary stillness floated the sharp twittering of sparrows and the bright laugh of a child at play in one of the neighboring yards. Above the grim outlines of the city, the sky shone divinely clear and blue, flecked by a single cloud, soft as an eagle's feather, which drifted in a mist of light above the horizon. The city, beneath that azure sky, borrowed the transparent brightness of an object that is imprisoned in crystal. White magic had transformed it for an hour, and the street, the houses, the shining elm tree, and the distant frowning brows of the skyscrapers all seemed as unreal as the vivid yet impalpable images in a dream. And into this world of crystal there drifted, like the essence of spring, the dreamy fragrance from the window box filled with white hyacinths. While she stood there, Gabriella thought pensively of many things. She thought of the day's work before her, of the gown she was designing for Mrs. Plethridge, of Fanny's latest lover, the brother of a schoolmate, of the clothes she should send the child to the White Sulphur Springs, of her mother, and of Jane's eldest daughter Margaret, and then very slowly, with the scent of the hyacinths drowning all merely prosaic memories, she began to think hopelessly and tenderly of Arthur Peyton. She thought of him as he had looked on the day when she had told him of her engagement, of the sympathetic expression in his eyes, and of his beautiful manner, which she had felt at the time she could never forget. Well, after 18 years she had not forgotten it. Compared with Arthur, all other men seemed to her as unreal as shadows. How could Miss Polly imagine that I'd think of Ben O'Hara after a love like that? She reflected indignantly. And then, perhaps because for a shadow he was so solidly substantial, she became aware that O'Hara's image was trespassing upon the hallowed soil of her reverie. To be sure, she had seen a great deal of him since George's death, when he had been so wonderfully considerate and helpful. Scarcely a day had passed since then that he had not brightened by some reminder of his friendship. They had spent long evenings together, and occasionally, accompanied by the delighted Miss Polly, they had gone to dinner at a restaurant and later to a concert or a play. That he had been almost too kind it was impossible for her to deny, but she had tried her best to repay him. She had, when one came to the point, done as much as she could to remedy the defects of his education. At first she had given zest, sympathy, eagerness to her self-appointed task of making him over. Then, as the months went by, a sense of doubt, of discouragement, of approaching failure had tempered her enthusiasm, and at last she had realized that her work, except in the merest details, had been ineffectual and futile. The differences, which she had regarded as superficial, were in reality fundamental. It was impossible to make him over because he was so completely himself. He stood quite definitely for certain tendencies in democracy, and by no ingenious manipulation could she twist him about until he presented the sham appearance of moving in the opposite direction. For the logic of her failure was perfectly simple. He couldn't see, however hard he tried, the things she wanted him to look at. The difficulty was far deeper than a mere matter of finish, or even of education, for it was, after all, not one of manner, but of material. Day by day she had realized more clearly that the problem confronting them was one which involved their different standards of living and their different philosophies. The things which she regarded as essential were to him only the accidental variations of life. He had lived so long in touch with the basic realities, with vast spaces and the stark aspect of desert horizons, with droughts and winds, and the unquenchable pangs of thirst and hunger, with the vital issues of birth and death in their most primitive forms. He had lived so long in touch with the simplest and most elemental forces of nature that his spirit, as well as his vision, had adjusted itself to a trackless and limitless field of view. No, what he was now he must remain, since to change him, except in trivial details, was out of her power. And of course he had his virtues. She would have been the last to deny him his virtues. Whenever she applied the touchstone of character, she realized how little alloy there was in the pure gold of his nature. He was truthful, he was generous, he was brave, kind, and tolerant, but his virtues, like his personality, were large, flamboyant, and without gradations of color. Custom had not pruned their natural luxuriance, nor had tradition toned down the violence of their contrasts. They were experimental, not established virtues, as obviously the expression of the man himself as was his uncultivated preference for red geraniums. For he possessed, she admitted, a sincerity such as she had not believed compatible with human designs, certainly not with human achievement. According to the code of the sheltered half of her sex, according to the inflexible code of her mother and Jane, he was not a gentleman. He lacked breeding, he lacked taste, he lacked the necessary education of schools. But in other ways, in ways peculiarly his own, she was beginning dimly to realize that he possessed qualities immeasurably larger than any superficial lack in his nature. In balance, moderation, restraint, in all the gracious attributes with which Arthur was endowed in her memory, in all the attributes she had particularly esteemed in the past, she understood that O'Hara would undoubtedly fall below her inherited standards. But, failing in these things, he had been able to command her respect by the sheer force of his character. Though he had, as he confessed to her, gone down into hell, she could not talk to him for an hour without recognizing that he had never lost a natural chivalry of mind, beside which the cultivated chivalry of manner appeared as exotic as an orchid in a hothouse. Even Arthur, she was aware, would have lied to her for her own good, but she would have trusted O'Hara to speak the truth to her at any cost. In this, as well as in his practical efficiency and his crude yet vital optimism, he embodied, she felt, the triumphs and the failures of American democracy, this democracy of ugly facts and of fine ideals, of crooked deeds and of straight feeling, of little codes and of large adventures, of puny lives and of heroic deaths, this democracy of the smoky present and the clear future. If this is our raw material today, she thought hopefully, what will the finished and signed product of tomorrow be? Gabriella, ain't these lovely? Whirling out of the sunshine, she saw Miss Polly holding a rustic basket of primroses and cowslips. Mr. O'Hara wants to know if he may speak to you for a minute before you go out. Oh, yes, I'm not in a hurry this morning. Then Miss Polly disappeared, and an instant later the vacant space in the doorway was filled exuberantly by O'Hara. I wanted to be the first to wish you a happy birthday, he began a little shyly, a little awkwardly, though his face was flushing with pleasure. The flowers are wonderful. For a minute, while she answered him, he seemed to be a part of the unreal, intense brightness of the world outside, of that magic world where the elm tree and the grass and the sunny street were all imprisoned in crystal. He diffused a glowing consciousness of success, a sanguine faith in the inherent goodness of experience. For, as she had discovered long ago, O'Hara was one of those who stood not for the elimination of struggle, but for the complete acceptance of life. He had sprung out of ugliness, he had lived intimately with evil, and yet, more than anyone she had ever known, he seemed to her to radiate the simple, uncalculating joy of living. He was the strongest person she knew, as well as the happiest. He had never evaded facts, never feared a risk, never shirked an issue, never lacked the hardy, adventurous courage of battle. In his own words, life had never found him a quitter. He stood in front of her now, fresh, smiling, robust, with his look of suddenly arrested energy, and the dark red of his hair, which was still moist from his bath, striking a vivid note against the cool grays and blues of the background. The sunshine, falling through the open window, warmed the ruddy tan of his face, and made his eyes like pools of clear light in which the jubilant spirit of the spring was reflected. After all, it isn't what one does, it is what one is that matters, she thought while she looked at him. At the end, as Miss Polly said, it is character, not circumstances, that counts. "I've been all over New York this morning looking for that basket," he said. Though he had been so eager to make light of his services to her in her trouble, she was amused from time to time by a childlike vanity which prompted him to impress her with the value of small attentions, and this she was swift to recognize as the opposite of Arthur's delicacy. It was the only littleness she had observed in O'Hara so far, this reluctance to hide his smaller lights under a bushel, and in its place it was amusing. Here was an obvious instance where nature, unassisted by training, appeared to fall short. "They couldn't be lovelier if you'd gone all over the world," she responded sincerely. Before answering her, he hesitated a moment, and she watched pityingly the struggle he was making toward an impossible self-expression. The thing he wanted to say, the thing struggling so pathetically in the inarticulateness of his feeling, would not, she knew, be uttered in words. "You are the first woman I ever wanted to send flowers to," he said presently, and added with abject infelicity, "It's strange, isn't it?" "Yes, it's strange," she assented pleasantly. Though his words were ineffectual, she was aware suddenly of a force before which she felt a vague impulse of flight. Now, if ever, she understood that she must keep their relations as superficial as she had always meant them to be, that she must cling with all her strength to the comfortable surface of appearances. "But you haven't had many women friends, have you?" "I've wanted to give other things," he went on hurriedly, "but not flowers. I never thought of flowers until I met you." "That's nice for me." She was growing nervous, and in her nervousness she precipitated the explosion by venturing rashly, "But there's Alice, too, isn't there, to like them?" Her voice was firm and friendly. Once for all she intended him to understand how aloof she stood from any sentimental advances. "Alice?" For an instant his response hung fire, enveloped in a fog of perplexity. Then, with an air of dispelling the cloud, he made a vigorous gesture of denial, and moved nearer to her with the swiftness and directness of a natural force. "Why, Alice was you. You were Alice all the time," he exclaimed energetically. "You mean—" She checked herself in alarm, paralyzed the next instant by the tremendous, unexpected blow of her discovery. "So you thought there was somebody else!" The delight in his face kept her silent, amazed, incapable of explanation. His arm was still outstretched, as if he were brushing aside the last flimsy barrier between them, and his voice, with its unrestrained and radiant joy, stirred some faintly quivering echoes in the secret depths of her being. It was as if the jubilant spirit of spring had flowered suddenly in his look. There wasn't anybody else. He came still nearer, and she stood there startled, incredulous, powerless either to retreat or to prevent the inevitable instant that was approaching. At least, there wasn't anybody I ever knew named Alice, except a schoolteacher when I was a kid. She was good and she was pretty like you, and I used to dream about her after school, and every evening at dusk I would go out of my way to speak to her in 6th Avenue. Once she told me that she'd wait for me to grow up and get rich so I could marry her, and after I went out to Arizona, I used to think about her a lot. When I came on you suddenly, standing there in the dusk with your hands full of lilacs, it all came back to me, because you look like her, with your dark hair and your tall slenderness. Then before I knew what I was doing, I called you by her name. I oughtn't to have done it," he finished ecstatically, "but I'm jolly glad now that I did." So he also, the man of action and of enterprise, he, the worker and the adventurer, so he also cultivated his garden of dreams. I didn't know, she found herself murmuring faintly in protest. "But you know now." His voice rang out exultantly, and though she felt that the thing she feared and dreaded was coming upon her, she still stood there without moving a step, without lifting a hand, mesmerized, enchanted by the force of the man. "You know now," he repeated. "You know now, Gabriella, and you knew all along." It was true. In spite of her surprise, in spite of her shrinking, in spite of her evasion, she confessed it in her heart. She had known all the time. Something deep down in her, something secret and profound and clairvoyant, had discerned the truth from the beginning. "No, no," she cried out sharply, for mistaking her silence, he had stooped to her with the directness which impelled all his movements, which so easily brushed aside and discarded intervening encumbrances, and had kissed her on the lips. For an instant, in the merciless tenderness of his arms, her resistance melted from her. Beneath the crash of the storm she did not think, she did not struggle, she did not murmur. Her consciousness seemed suspended, and with her consciousness, her memory, her judgment, even her passionate, unshaken loyalty to the love of her youth. Then, after the moment of weakness, of passive submission, it was as if her soul and body caught fire at a flash, and a quiver of anger ran through her, enkindling her glance and nerving her spirit. "But I do not love you. I never meant that I loved you," she cried. At her words, his arms dropped to his sides, and he stood as if turned to stone, with only his questioning eyes and the vivid red of his hair seeming alive. There was no need now for her to struggle. At her first movement to escape, he had released her and drawn to a distance. "You don't love me?" he stammered. "Why, I saw it. I've seen it for weeks. I see it now in your face." "You see nothing, nothing." She denied it bitterly. "I liked you as a friend. I did not think of this. I never suspected it. I don't love you. I don't love you in the least." He was very still. The jubilant spirit of the spring had ebbed away from his look, and even in the height of her anger she was struck by the change in his face. "I don't believe you," he said gravely after a minute. "I don't believe you." "You must believe me. I don't love you. I have never thought of you except as a friend. I have loved another man all my life." Her voice rose accusingly, triumphantly, and so fervent was her look that she might have been repeating a creed. It was as if she hoped by convincing him to persuade her own rebellious heart of the truth she proclaimed. Now at last he understood. She had been lucid enough even for the crystalline lucidity of his thought. "I am sorry. I made a mistake," he said quietly, and after the exultant note of a few minutes ago, there was a dull level of flatness in his voice. "I am sorry. There don't seem to be anything else that I can say or do, but it wouldn't have happened if I had understood." He paused, looked at her closely for a minute, and then added stubbornly, with an echo of the old confidence in his tone, "I still don't believe it." "It is true, nevertheless." She was trembling with indignation, and this indignation, in spite of her natural fairness, was not directed against herself, against her own blindness and folly. Though she knew that she was to blame, she was furious not with herself, but with O'Hara. He had insulted her, and she resolved bitterly that she would never forgive him. Even now, whenever she was silent, she could still feel his kiss on her mouth, and the vividness of the sensation stung her into passionate anger. She was no longer the reasonable and competent Gabriella, who had so successfully managed her life. She was primitive woman in the grip of primitive anger, and balance, moderation, restraint had flown from her soul. The very mystery of her feeling, its complexity, its suddenness, its remorselessness, these emotions worked together to deepen the sense of insult, of injury, with which she burned. "It is true, and you have no right to doubt it. You have no right." She caught her breath sharply, and then went on with inexcusable harshness. "Even if there hadn't been anyone else, I could never in the world." Her loss of self-control gave him an advantage, which he was either too generous or too stupid to perceive. "Well, forget all about it. I am going now," he answered quietly. While she watched him moving away from her, she was conscious of an inexplicable longing to stab him again more deeply before she lost him forever. It was intolerable to her that he should leave her while she was still indignant, that he should evade her just resentment by the natural cowardice of flight. "I can't forget it," she said. "How can you expect me to?" For an instant he seemed on the point of smiling. Then, turning at the door, he walked back to where she was standing, and said gravely, "When I came in here, it was to ask you to marry me, and if it's the last word I ever speak, I thought you understood, that you knew how I felt. I was even fool enough to think that you would be willing to marry me. That's all I can say. I haven't any other excuses." For the second time he went to the door, opened it, and then turning quickly came back again. "I am not the sort to change, and I shan't change about this. You are a free woman, and if you ever feel that you made a mistake, if you ever want me or need me, you can just come to me. I shan't stop caring for you, and if you choose to come, I'll be waiting. I believed you were meant for me when I first saw you, and I believe it now. In spite of all you say, I'm going to keep on believing it." He went out, closing the door softly, and 5 minutes later, feeling extraordinarily young, she watched him pass through the gate and walk as buoyantly as ever in the direction of Broadway. While she looked after him, she wondered suddenly why novelists always drop their heroines as soon as they pass 27. If I'd been in a play, they'd have put me in the background, dressed in lavender, and made me look on and do fancy work, she thought humorously. But this is real life, and I've just had a real love scene on my 38th birthday. He couldn't have been more romantic if I'd been Fanny, she mused with an agreeable complacency. It's only in books and plays that people stop falling in love when they pass the 20s. I don't believe they ever stop in real life. I believe it goes on forever. And glancing at the glass, she added truthfully, "I want love more today than I wanted it when I was 20, and so does Ben O'Hara." A sensation of stifling, as if her throat were closing together, oppressed her suddenly, and picking up her handbag, she ran downstairs and out of the house. End of section 31. Recording by Nancy Halper. Summit, New Jersey. Section 32 of Life and Gabriella by Ellen Glasgow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2nd. The Age of Knowledge. Chapter 9. The Past. Part 2. By the time she reached Broadway, her anger had ebbed, but the oppression, the feeling that she was being slowly smothered, was still in her throat and bosom. After all, seen in the sober light of reason, why had she been so indignant? There had been a misapprehension. He had thought that she was in love with him, and thinking so, he had kissed her. That was the case plainly stated. And what was there in this to send a burning rush of anger to her heart? What was there in this that had made her turn and insult him? For the first time in her life, she had lost her temper without cause, and had raged, she told herself sternly, like a fury. And beneath her rage, she had been conscious always of some vague, incomprehensible disloyalty to Arthur, of a feeling of humiliation, of self-reproach, which appeared ridiculous when she remembered that she had been kissed against her will and without warning. But in spite of this, she knew intuitively, with a knowledge deeper than reason, that the glory of her dream had paled in the moment when she lay in O'Hara's arms. A subtle change had come over the spirit of spring since she had left the elm tree and the emerald veil of the grass. It was no longer jubilant, but languorous, wistful, haunting, as if eternally pursued through the fugitive seasons, an immortal and ineffable beauty. The enchanted crystal had been shattered in an instant, and she saw life now, not imprisoned in magical sunshine, but gray, sordid, monotonous, as utterly hopeless as the faces thronging in Broadway. Yet not many months ago she had seen in these same faces the inward hope, the joy in sadness, the gaiety in disappointment, which had brightened the world for her. Then she had been aware of an invisible current flowing from the crowd to herself. But today this shining current was broken, or turned aside, and she felt detached, adrift, and distrustful of the future. That mental correspondence with the mood of the crowd, with the life of the city, which had come to her first on the brilliant morning in September, and then again when she walked home with O'Hara in the winter's dusk, which had released a new faculty in her soul, and had given her a fresh perception of human responsibilities. This had deserted her so utterly that she could barely remember its miraculous visitation. Then her personal life had seemed to become a part of the life of the street, of the sky, of the mysterious city outlined against the gray background of dusk. Today, she walked alone and without sympathy through the crowd. Her feet dragged, and she felt dully that she had lost her share in both the street and the sky. The very faces of the men and women around her, those lethargic foreign faces which crowded out the finer American type, awoke in her the sensation of hopeless revolt, which one feels before the impending destruction of higher forms by masses of inert and conscienceless matter. She thought gloomily, "I have lost the vision. There is no hope either for me or for America, except in the clear vision of the future." And while she spoke, there passed over her the vague feeling of loss, of something missing, as if a precious possession had slipped from her grasp. Her morning's work was unusually trying, and at 1:00, when she put on her hat before going out to lunch, she asked herself dejectedly, "What can be the matter with me? Before I go home, I'll take a taxicab and drive up Riverside for an hour. If only the children were here, I should not feel so depressed." She remembered regretfully that Archibald and Fanny would be away all summer, and then, from thinking of her children, she passed by almost insensible degrees of despondency to meditating pensively about Arthur Peyton. What a wreck, what an inconceivably stupid wreck she had made of her happiness. As she entered the outer showroom on her way to the street, she heard the voice of Miss Murphy attuned to a cooing pitch, and glancing around a little painted cabinet, filled with useless ornaments, which stood in the center of the floor, she beheld a dazzling head of reddish gold before one of the elaborately decorated French mirrors. While she advanced, the red gold waves, worn with extreme flatness over a forehead of pearly whiteness, were submerged for a minute in the smallest and roundest hat in the shop, and from a fashionable figure, reminding her vaguely of an ambulatory dressmaker's model, there issued a high, fluting note of delighted ejaculation. "This is just exactly what I've been looking all over New York for. Now, isn't it too funny for anything that I should have found it right here the very minute I came in?" As Gabriella's face flashed back from the mirror, the fashionable figure sprang suddenly to life, and the voice, still fluting delightedly, exclaimed, "Why, Gabriella, where on earth did you come from?" For a minute, sheer amazement kept Gabriella clinging helplessly to the ridiculous cabinet, from the top of which an artificial rosebush seemed to shower artificial pink petals down on her head. Then, recovering herself with a sharp effort of will, she went forward a few steps beyond the shelter of the cabinet and said composedly, "How do you do, Florrie? I did not recognize you at first." For it was Florrie herself, Florrie in the flesh, Florrie glowing, sparkling, prosperous, victorious. Her figure, conforming to the latest mode, had lost its pinched protuberances, and was long, slender, sinuous in its perfection of line. Beneath the small round hat, her hair, glossy with brilliantine, was like melted gold in the large, loose waves which revealed the rosy tips of her ears. She was 39, and she looked scarcely a day over 25. The peach blossom texture of her skin was as unlined by care or pain as if she had spent the last 10 years immured in a convent. For in this case, at least, Gabriella realized while she looked at her, the retribution which awaits upon sinners had been tardy in its fulfillment. As she moved toward her, without noticing the friendly hand that Florrie held out, Gabriella was conscious of an ironical inclination to laugh. Though she felt no bitter personal resentment against Florrie, for, after all, Florrie had not been able to hurt her, there struggled in her bosom an indignation more profound, more moving, than any merely personal emotion could be. Her resentment was directed not against Florrie, but against some abstract destiny which had permitted Florrie to have her way without paying the price. For on the pinnacle of a destructive career, unsinged by the conflagration she had so carelessly started, Florrie was poised securely, crowned, triumphant, rejoicing. On her dazzling height, successful and happy, she was as far removed as one could imaginably be from the repentant Magdalene of tradition. The memory of George's face as it looked in death floated before the austere mental vision of Gabriella, and she reflected grimly that tradition was not always the mirror of life. For in this one case, at least, the man, not the woman, had been the victim of natural law, and Florrie, fool though she was, had shown herself at the hour of requital to be stronger than fate. By that instinctive wisdom, which is so much older, so much truer than civilization, she had triumphed over the ordination of life. In refusing to suffer, she had blunted every weapon with which nature might have punished her in the end. Not by virtue, since she had none, but by pure insensibility, she had escaped the wages of sin. She was a sensualist whose sensuality, hard, metallic, glittering, encased her like armor. At Gabriella's approach, Miss Murphy fluttered off cooingly in the direction of a fresh customer, and only the festively garlanded French mirror witnessed the meeting of the two who had been schoolgirls together. Swift as an arrow, there shot through Gabriella's mind, "I wonder what Ben O'Hara would think of her." Then she checked the dangerous flight of her fancy, for she remembered that O'Hara's thoughts about anything no longer concerned her. "Are you buying a hat?" inquired Florrie curiously. "No, I belong here. I am Madame Denard." "You don't mean it! I never should have believed it. The idea of your being a dressmaker. That's why you look so smart, I suppose. You're the smartest thing I've seen anywhere. But you look older, Gabriella." Well, you don't. It was perfectly true. Except for the gaudy decorations and the twanging accents of the arrogant young woman, Gabriella might have imagined herself in the last century atmosphere of Broad Street in the middle 90s. "I must tell you about the things I use." Florrie was always generous. "But I declare if I'd known this place was yours, I'd have got my hats here ages ago. Of course I knew it was dreadfully swell, but I thought the prices were beyond anything." "They are," responded Gabriella with businesslike brevity. while she glanced about for the flitting Miss Murphy. "Look here, Gabriella, I hope you don't bear me any malice." Florrie burst out solicitously, for her frankness, like her sensuality, was elemental in its audacity. "You oughtn't to, if you know what I saved you from," she proceeded convincingly. "Anyway, we were chums long before either of us ever thought about a man, and I didn't really do you a bit of harm. It wasn't as if you cared about George, was it?" No, it wasn't as if I cared about him. Gabriella was answering the appeal as truthfully as if Florrie had been the most excellent of her sex. "You didn't harm me in any way, not in any way," she repeated with firmness. "That's just the way I told Mother you'd look at it. I knew you were always so broad-minded, even as a girl. Then there isn't any reason we shouldn't be friends, just as we used to be." Gabriella shook her head, polite but implacable in her refusal. "It isn't what you did to me, Florrie," she answered gently. "It's what you are that I can't forgive. I can imagine that a good woman might do almost anything, might even run off with another woman's husband. But you aren't good. You wouldn't be good if you'd spent your life in a convent." A quick flush, the flush of temper, stained the pearly whiteness of Florrie's skin. "Oh, of course, if you don't want to," she retorted, a little shrilly, though she tried to subdue her rebellious voice to the pitch of Fifth Avenue. "I only thought that being a working woman, you wouldn't have so very many friends, and you might get lonely. I had seats at the opera every night last winter, and time and again I'd have been glad to have given them to you. Then, too, I might have been able to bring you some custom. I know any number of rich women who don't think anything of paying $1,000 for a dress." Her insolence was so evidently the result of anger that Gabriella, without interrupting the flow, waited courteously until she paused. "No, you cannot do anything for me, Florrie." Though Gabriella's voice was crisp and firm, her face looked suddenly older, and little lines, stamped by weariness and regret, appeared at the corners of her still brilliant eyes. "I don't wish you any harm," she went on more softly. "If you were in trouble, I'd do what I could for you. But somehow I don't seem able to forgive you for being what you are. Would you like to look at anything else?" she inquired in her professional tone. "Miss Murphy is waiting to show you some hats." Her cheeks were burning when she passed out of the ivory and gold door, saluted deferentially by the attendant in livery. The effrontery, she thought, the bare-faced effrontery. And then, as her eyes fell on Florrie's trim little electric coupe beside the curb, she exclaimed mentally, recalling George's animated perplexity about the pearl necklace, "I wonder how in the world she does it." The meeting with Florrie appeared to her, as she walked home that afternoon, to be the last touch needed to push her into a state of utter despondency. The oppressive languor of the day had exhausted her strength, and when she left Dinard's, she felt too indifferent, too spiritless even for the drive in the park. It was still light when she got out of the stage at 23rd Street, and while she strolled listlessly down the blocks on the west side, she had again that curious sensation of smothering which had come to her after her talk with O'Hara. At the corner of 6th Avenue, a young Italian, with the face of a poet, was roasting peanuts in a little kerosene stove, beside a flickering torch which enkindled the romantic youth in his eyes. Farther away, some ragged children were dancing to the music of a hand organ, which ground out a melancholy waltz, and from a tiny flower stall behind the stand of a bootblack there drifted the intense sweetness of hyacinths. An old Negro, carrying a basket of clothes, passed her in the middle of the block, and she thought, that might have been in Richmond, that and the hand organ and the perfume of hyacinths. A vision of Hill Street floated before her, the long straight street, with the sudden drop of ragged hill at the end, the old houses with crumbling porches and countless signs, boarders wanted in the windows between the patched curtains, the irregular rows of tulip, poplar, elm, or sycamore trees throwing their crooked shadows over the cobblestones, the blades of grass sprouting along the edges of the brick pavement. The vision of Hill Street as she remembered it 20 years ago in her girlhood, and then the image of her mother's face, gazing out beneath the creamy blossoms and the dark shining leaves of the old magnolia tree. Everything must have changed. I'd hardly recognize it, she thought. Nobody we know lives on that side now, Mother says. Yes, it has been a long time. She sighed, and then a little laugh broke from her lips as she remembered that Charlie, who had recently been west on a business trip, had brought home the good news that Richmond was as progressive as Denver. At least, it seemed so to Charlie, Mrs. Carr had hastened to add. But you know how proud Charlie is of all our newness. He says there is not a street in the West that looks fresher or more beautiful than Monument Avenue, and I am sure that is a great comfort. Cousin Jimmy says it shows what the South can do when it tries. I'd like to go back, mused Gabriella, walking more and more slowly. I haven't been home for 18 years, and I am 38 today. With the fugitive sweetness of the hyacinths, there rushed over her again the feeling that life was slipping, and that she was missing something infinitely precious, something infinitely desirable. It was the panic of fleeting youth, of youth unsatisfied, denied, and still insatiable. As she entered the gate, she saw that O'Hara's windows were dark, and while a sigh of relief escaped her, she felt a swift contraction of her throat, as if she had become suddenly paralyzed and was unable to swallow. I hope he has gone, she said to herself in a whisper. If he has gone, everything will be so much easier. But even to herself, she could not explain what it was that would be made easier. Her relief was so vague that when she endeavored to put it into words, it seemed to dissolve and evaporate. Miss Polly was watering the flowers in the window box, and turning with the green watering pot in her hand, she stared at Gabriella in silence for a minute before she exclaimed anxiously, "Mercy on us, Gabriella, what on earth is the matter?" "Nothing. I've had a hard day, and I'm tired." "Well, you lie right straight down as soon as you take off your hat. I declare you look 10 years older than you did this morning." "I have seen Florrie for a minute." "I reckon that was enough to upset anybody. Did she say she was sorry?" "Sorry? She looked as if she had never been sorry for anything in her life. She was handsomer than ever. Don't you remember how much you always admired her figure? And she didn't look a day over 25. I don't believe she has ever known what it is to feel a regret." "Well, you just wait, honey," responded Miss Polly consolingly. "You just wait. She'll be punished yet as sure as you're born." "Oh, I'm not waiting for that. I don't wish her to be punished. Why should I? She is what she is." "Do you suppose she knows about George?" "I doubt it. She didn't speak of his death. She is quite capable of forgetting that she ever knew him, and if she does think of him, it is probably as a man who betrayed her innocence. You may be sure she has twisted it all about until every shred of the blame rests on somebody else. Florrie isn't the only woman who is made like that, but I believe," she reasoned it out coolly, "that it is her way of keeping her youth." Miss Polly had put down the watering pot, and she came presently with a bottle of camphor to the sofa where Gabriella was lying. "Are you sure you wouldn't like me to rub your head?" she inquired. "Dinner will be ready in a minute, but I shouldn't change my dress if I were you." Gabriella rose slowly to a sitting position, and then stood up while she pushed the camphor away. "I hate the smell of it," she answered. "It makes me think of one of Jane's attacks. And besides, I don't need it. There is nothing in the world the matter with me." A moment later, to Miss Polly's unspeakable amazement, she sank down again, flung her arms over the back of the sofa, and burst into tears. "Well, I never!" ejaculated Miss Polly, rooted to the spot. "Well, I never!" In the 10 years she had lived with Gabriella, she had never seen her cry, not even after George's flight, and she felt as if the solid ground on which she stood had crumbled without warning, and left her insecurely balanced in space. "Something certainly must be wrong, for it ain't like you to give way. Are you real sure you ain't got a pain somewhere?" Shaking her head and swallowing her sobs with an effort, Gabriella rose to her feet. "I'm just tired out, that's all," she said, strangely humble and deprecating. "You must have been working too hard. It ain't right." For a minute or two, the little seamstress brooded anxiously. Then, guided by an infallible instinct, she added decisively, "It's been a long time since you've seen your ma, and she's getting right smart along. Why don't you run down home for a few days while the flowers are blooming?" A change passed over Gabriella's face, and drying her eyes, she looked down on Miss Polly with a lovely, enigmatical smile. "I wonder if I might," she said doubtfully. "There ain't any earthly reason why you shouldn't. Tomorrow's Friday, and they can get along without you at Dinard's perfectly well till the first of the week." "Oh, yes, they can get along. I was only wondering." A faint breeze stole in through the window, wafting toward her the scent of wet flowers. "I was only wondering." Her eyes grew suddenly radiant, and lifting her arms, she made a gesture as of one escaping from bondage. "I was only wondering if I might go tomorrow," she said. End of section 32. Recording by Nancy Halper, Summit, New Jersey. Section 33 of Life and Gabriella by Ellen Glasgow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2nd, The Age of Knowledge. Chapter 10, The Dream and the Reality. Part 1. At the upper station, a little group stood awaiting her, and as the train pulled slowly to the platform, Gabriella distinguished her mother's pallid face framed in the hanging crepe of her veil. Jane, thin, anxious, anemic, with her look of pinched sweetness. Charlie, florid, portly, and virtuously middle-aged, and their eldest daughter Margaret, a blooming, beautiful girl. Alighting, Gabriella was embraced by Mrs. Carr, who shed a few gentle tears on her shoulders. "Gabriella, my child, I thought you would never come back to us," she lamented, "and now everything is so changed that you will hardly recognize it as home." "Well, if she can find a change that isn't for the better, I hope she'll point it out and let me make note of it," boasted Charlie with hilarity. "I tell you what, Gabriella, my dear, we're becoming a #1 city. Everything's new. We haven't left so much as an old brick lying around if we could help it. If you were to go back there to Hill Street, you'd scarcely know it for the hospitals and schools we've got there. And as for this part of the town, well, I reckon the apartment houses will fairly take your breath away. Apartment houses. Well, that's what I call progress. Apartment houses and skyscrapers, and we've got them, too, down on Main Street. I'll show them to you tomorrow. Yes, by George, we're progressing so fast you can hardly see how we grow. Why, there wasn't a skyscraper or an apartment house in the city when you left here, and precious few hospitals. But now, well, I'll show you. We're the hospital city of the South, and more than that, we're becoming a metropolis. Yes, that's the word. We're becoming a metropolis. If you don't believe me, just watch as we go up Franklin Street to Monument Avenue. I suppose you thought of us still as a poor, folksy little southern city, with a lot of ground going to waste in gardens and green stuff. Well, you just wait till you see Monument Avenue. It's the handsomest boulevard south of Washington. It's all new, every brick of it. There's not a house the whole way up that isn't as fresh as paint, and the avenue is just as straight as if you'd drawn it with a ruler. But the change in the city, Gabriella reflected while she embraced Jane, was as nothing compared to the incredible change in Charlie himself. Middle age had passed over him like some fattening and solidifying process. He was healthy, he was corpulent, he was prosperous, conventional, and commonplace. If Gabriella had been seeking, with Hogarthian humor, to portray the evils of torpid and self-satisfied respectability, she could scarcely have found a better picture of the condition than Charlie presented. And the more Charlie expanded, the more bloodless and wan Jane appeared at his side. Her small, flat face, with its yellowish and unhealthy tinge, its light, melancholy eyes, and its look of lifeless and inhuman sanctification, exhaled the dried fragrance of a pressed flower. So disheartening was her appearance to Gabriella that it was a relief to turn from her to the freshness of Margaret, handsome, athletic, with cheeks like roses and the natural grace of a young animal. "Oh, Aunt Gabriella, I hadn't any idea you were like this," cried the girl with naive enthusiasm. "You thought of me as gray-haired and wearing a bonnet and mantle?" "No, not that, but I didn't dream you were so handsome. I thought Mother was the beauty of the family. But what a wonderful dress you have on. Are they wearing all those flounces around the hips?" "There is no doubt about it. You are getting a lot better looking as you grow older," observed Charlie with genial pleasantry. "She keeps herself up. There is a great deal in that," remarked Jane, and the speech was so characteristic of her that Gabriella tossed back gaily, "Well, I'm not old, you know. I'm only 38. "She married so young," said Mrs. Carr mournfully. "I hope none of your girls will marry young, Jane. Gabriella must be a warning to them, and to clear little Fanny." "But you married young, Mother, and so did I," replied Jane, a trifle tartly. For some incommunicable reason, Jane's sweetness had become decidedly prickly. Charlie's reformation had left her with the hurt and incredulous air of a missionary whose heathens have been converted under his eyes by a rival denomination, and obeying an entirely natural impulse, she appeared ever so slightly, and in the most refined manner possible, to revenge herself on the other members of her family. Though she had of late devoted her attention to the Associated Charities and the Confederate Museum, neither of these worthy objects provided so agreeable an opportunity for the exercise of her benevolent instincts as did the presence of a wayward husband in the household, for there could be no question of the thoroughness of Charlie's redemption. The very cut of his clothes, the very color of his necktie, proclaimed a triumph for the Prohibition party. At last they were packed tightly in the touring car, and Charlie, after imparting directions with the manner of a man who regards himself as the fount of wisdom, began expounding the noisy gospel of progress to Gabriella. Mrs. Carr, who had never been active, and was now over 70, was visibly excited by the suddenness with which she had been whisked from the platform, and while they shot away from the station, she clutched her crape veil despairingly to the sides of her face, and fixed her blank and terrified stare on her son-in-law. After a whispered conference with Jane, Gabriella discovered that her mother was less afraid of an accident than she was of fresh air. "She's afraid of neuralgia," whispered Jane, "but the doctor says the air can't possibly do her any harm." In Franklin Street the trees were in full leaf, and the charming vista through which Gabriella looked at the sunset softened mercifully the impending symbols of the ironic spirit of progress. It was modern, it was progressive, yet there was the ancient lassitude of spring in the faint sunshine, and the women passing under the vivid green of the elms and maples moved with a flowing walk which one did not see in Fifth Avenue. On the porches, too, groups were assembled in chairs after the Southern fashion, while children, in white frocks and gay sashes, accompanied by Negro nurses wheeling perambulators, made a spring pageant in the parks. Though the gardens had either disappeared or dwindled to mere emerald patches of grass, a few climbing roses of modern varieties lent brightness and fragrance to the solid, if undistinguished, architecture of the houses. "That's the finest apartment house in the city," exclaimed Charlie with enthusiasm. "Looks pretty tall, doesn't it? But it's nothing to the height of some of the buildings downtown. As for changes, well, I hope Jane will take you on Broad Street tomorrow, and then you'll see what we're doing. Why, there's not a shop left there now where you used to deal. Brandywine's. You recollect old Brandywine and Plumbers, don't you? Isn't there any longer. Got a new department store, with a restaurant and a basement in the very spot where it used to be. Look sharp now, we're coming to a hospital. That belongs to Dr. Browning. You don't remember Dr. Browning. After your day, I reckon. He's a young chap, but he's got his hospital like all the rest, and every bed filled. He told me so yesterday. But they've all got their hospitals. Darrow. You recollect Darrow, who used to be old Dr. Walker's assistant? Well, he's got his, too, just around the corner on the next street. They say he cuts up more people than any man in the South except Spenlow. I miss the old-fashioned flowers, said Gabriella to her mother in one of Charlie's plethoric pauses. The microphylla roses and snowballs. Everybody is planting crimson ramblers and hydrangeas now, responded Mrs. Carr, with something of her son-in-law's pride in the onward movement of her surroundings. Here are the monuments, cried Charlie, who had treated each apartment house or hospital as if it were a bright, inestimable jewel in the city's crown. You don't see many streets finer than this in New York, do you? It looks very pretty and attractive, answered Gabriella, as they swung dangerously round a statue and then started in a race up the avenue. But I miss the shrubs and the flowers. Oh, there are flowers enough. You just wait till you get on a bit. We've got some urns filled with hydrangeas, that queer new sort between blue and pink. But what do you want with shrubs? All they're good for is to get in your way whenever you want to look out into the street. Mrs. Madison was telling me only yesterday that she cut down the lilac bushes in her front yard because they kept her from recognizing the people in motor cars. Look at that house now. That's one of the finest in the city. Rushington built it. He made his money in fertilizers. And the one next with the green tiles belongs to Hanley, the tobacco trust fellow, you know. And this whopper on the next square is where Albertson lives. He made his pile out of railroad stocks. He's one of the banking firm of Albertson, Jacobstein, Moss & Company. Awfully clever fellows, but too tricky for me. I give them a wide berth when I go out to do business. But where are the old people, the people I used to know? Oh, they're scattered about everywhere, but they haven't got most of the money. A lot of 'em live up here, and a lot are down in Franklin Street in the same old houses. Tell me about Cousin Jimmy. He's up here, too. Pussy planned that red brick house with the green shutters next door to us. I reckon Jimmy is about as prosperous as is good for him, but he's getting on. He must be over 70 now. He has a son who is a chip off the old block, and his youngest daughter was the prettiest girl who ever came out here. Margaret will tell you about her. And the Peytons? Her voice trembled, and she looked hastily away from the keen eyes of Margaret. They are still in the old home. At least, Arthur lives there with his cousin Nellie. You know Mrs. Peyton died about 9 or 10 years ago? Yes, I heard it. She was getting on, but it was a great loss to Arthur. Somehow, I could never make up my mind about Arthur. He was bright enough as a young chap, and we used to think he would have a brilliant future. But when the time came, he never seemed to catch on. He wasn't progressive, and he has never amounted to much more than he did when he left college. What I say about him is that he had the wrong ideas. Yes, Jane, I mean exactly what I say. He had the wrong ideas. He doesn't know what he is driving at. No progress, no push, no punch in him. Why, Charlie, murmured Mrs. Carr reproachfully, while Jane, recovering her nagging manner with an accession of spirit, remonstrated feelingly, Charlie, you really must be more careful what you say. Oh, fudge, retorted Charlie with playful rudeness. You see she's still at it, Gabriella, he pursued, winking audaciously. If it isn't one thing, it's another. But she wouldn't be satisfied with perfection. Well, here we are. There are the hydrangeas. I hope you're pleased. I declare those waste papers have blown right back again on the grass, and I had them picked up the last thing before I left, said Jane in a tone of annoyance. Never mind the papers. Gabriella isn't looking for papers, returned Charlie, while he helped Mrs. Carr out of the motor and up the steps. So here you are, Mother, and the air didn't kill you. I may have neuralgia tomorrow, you never can tell, replied Mrs. Carr. I shouldn't worry about the papers, Jane. Nobody can help the way they blow about. I want Gabriella to see the children the first thing." As they entered the house, Jane's children, a flock of 5 girls and 2 boys, fluttered up to be introduced, and among them, Gabriella discovered the composed baby of Jane's tragic flight. It seemed an age ago, and she felt not 38, but 1,000. After dinner, Charlie, who had eaten immoderately, unfolded the evening paper under the electric lamp in the library, and dozed torpidly while the girls plied their aunt with innumerable questions about New York and the spring fashions. "It will be lovely to have Fanny with us at the White Sulphur. I know her clothes will be wonderful," they chirped happily, clustering eagerly about the sofa on which Gabriella was sitting. Jane's children, deriving from some hardy stock of an earlier generation, were handsome, vigorous, optimistic in blood and fiber, and so uncompromisingly modern that Gabriella wondered how Mrs. Carr, with her spiritual neuralgia and her perpetual mourning, had survived the unceasing currents of fresh air with which they surrounded her. Yes, things have changed. It is the age, thought Gabriella, and presently, when Cousin Jimmy and Cousin Pussy came in to welcome her, she repeated, "Yes, it is the age. There is no escaping it." "Why, my dear child, you are looking splendidly," trilled Cousin Pussy, with her old, delightful manner, and her flattering vision so different from Florrie's. She was still trim, plump, and rosy, though her hair was now snow-white, and her pretty face was covered with cheerful wrinkles. "You are handsomer than you ever were in your life, and the dash of gray on your temples doesn't make you look a day older, not a day. Some people turn gray so very young. I remember Cousin Becky Bolingbroke's hair was almost white by the time she was 35. It runs like that in some families. But you look just as girlish as ever. It's wonderful, isn't it, Cousin Fanny, the way the women of this generation stay girls until they are 50? I don't believe you'll ever look any older, Gabriella, than you do now. Of course, I suppose your business has something to do with it, but if I met you for the first time, it would never cross my mind that you were a day over 25. Well, well, so little Gabriella went to New York and became a dressmaker, observed Jimmy, who was seldom original. And she's the same Gabriella, too. I always said, you know, that she was the sort you could count on. Age, though it had not entirely passed him by, had on the whole treated him with great gentleness. He was a remarkably handsome old man, with a distinguished and courtly presence, a head of wonderful white hair, which looked as if it had been powdered, a ruddy, unwrinkled face, and the dark shining eyes of the adventurous youth he had never lost. Of course, she couldn't have been a dressmaker here where everybody knows her, purred Cousin Pussy, with her arm about Gabriella, but in New York it is different, and they tell me that even titled women are dressmakers in London. Well, she has pluck, declared Cousin Jimmy, as he had declared 18 years ago at the family council. There's nothing like pluck when it comes to getting along in the world. Then they sat down in Jane's library, which contained most of the things Gabriella associated with the old parlor in Hill Street, and Cousin Pussy asked if Gabriella had found many changes. "A great many. Everything looks new to me except this room. The only thing I miss here is the horsehair sofa." "I keep that in the back hall," said Jane. "The town does look different up here, but the Peytons' house is just as you remember it. Even the scarlet sage is in the garden. Miss Nellie plants it still every summer." A lovely light shone in Gabriella's eyes, and Cousin Pussy watched it tenderly, while a smile hovered about the corners of her shrewd, though still pretty mouth. "It has been such a disappointment that Arthur hasn't done more in his profession," she said presently. "But as I was saying to Mr. Wren only the other day, I have always felt that dear Gabriella was to blame for it." "The trouble with Arthur," observed Charlie, awaking truculently from his doze, "is that he's got the wrong ideas. When a man has the wrong ideas in these days, he might as well go out and hang himself." "Well, I don't know that I'd call his ideas wrong exactly," reasoned Cousin Jimmy, with the judicial manner befitting the best judge of tobacco in Virginia. I shouldn't call them wrong, but they're out of date. They belong to the last century. I always say that dear Arthur is a perfect gentleman of the old school, remonstrated Mrs. Carr, meekly obstinate. There aren't many of them left now, so I tell myself regretfully whenever I see him. And there'll be fewer than ever by the time you suffragists get your rights, remarked Charlie with bitterness, while Mrs. Carr, incensed by the word, which she associated with various indelicacies, stared at him with an indignant expression. "Charlie, be careful what you say," nagged Jane acridly from her corner. "Now that so many of our relatives have gone in for suffrage, you mustn't be intolerant." "I cannot help it, Jane. I shall never knowingly bow to one, even if she is related to me," announced Mrs. Carr, more assertively than Gabriella would have believed possible. "Well, for my part, Cousin Fanny, I can't feel that it hurts me to bow to anybody," said Pussy, with her unfailing kindness of heart. "Why, I even bowed to Florrie Spencer last winter. I wanted to cut her, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it when I met her face to face. I hope you don't mind, dear," she whispered to Gabriella. "I suppose I oughtn't to have mentioned her, but I forgot." "Oh, it doesn't matter in the least," responded Gabriella cheerfully. "I bowed to her myself the day before I left New York." Though she tried to be independent, to be advanced and resolute, she felt the last 18 years receding slowly from her consciousness. The family point of view, the family soul, had enveloped her again, and in spite of her experience and her success, she seemed inwardly as young and ignorant as on the evening when she broke her engagement to Arthur. The spirit of the place had defeated her individual endeavor. Except for the wallpaper of pale gray and the Persian rugs on the floor, Jane's library might have been the old front parlor in Hill Street, and it was as if the French mirror, the crystal candelabra, the rosewood bookcases, with their diamond-shaped panes lined with fluted magenta silk, the family portraits, the speckled engravings of the burial of Latenay, and of the groups of amiable children feeding chickens and fish. It was as if these inanimate objects exuded a spiritual anodyne which enfeebled the will. Across the hall, in the modern pink and gray drawing room, the 5 girls were playing bridge with several young men whom Gabriella remembered as babies, and the sounds of their voices floated to her now and then as thinly as if they had come out of a phonograph. There is nothing better than peace, after all, she thought, while her eyes rested tenderly on the simple, affectionate face of Cousin Jimmy. Goodness and peace, these things are really worthwhile. Then the telephone rang gently, and after a minute Margaret, who had gone to answer it, came in with a roguish smile on her lips. "Aunt Gabriella, Mr. Peyton wishes to come tomorrow at 5, she said, and the roguish smile flitted from her lips to the lips of Cousin Pussy, and from Cousin Pussy to each sympathetic and watchful face in the group. "You may say what you please," argued Charlie, still truculent. "The whole trouble with Arthur is that he has got the wrong ideas." End of section 33. Recording by Nancy Halper, Summit, New Jersey. Section 34 of Life and Gabriella by Ellen Glasgow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2nd. The Age of Knowledge. Chapter 10. The Dream and the Reality. Part 2. At 5 o'clock the next day, the family crowded into the touring car for an excursion and left Gabriella in a deserted house to receive the lover of her girlhood. Before going, Mrs. Carr had embraced her sentimentally. Charlie had dropped one of his broad jokes on the subject of the reunion. Jane had murmured sweetly that there was no man on earth she admired as much as she did Arthur, and the girls had effusively complimented Gabriella on her appearance. Even Willie, the baby of 18 years ago, had prophesied with hilarity that old Arthur Peyton wasn't coming for nothing. One and all, they appeared to take her part in the romance for granted. And while she waited in the drawing-room, gazing through the interstices of Jane's new lace curtains into the avenue, where beyond the flying motor cars, the grassy strip in the middle of the street was dappled with shadows, she wondered if she also were taking Arthur's devotion for granted. She had not seen him for 18 years, and yet she was awaiting him as expectantly as if he were still her lover. Would his presence really quiet this strange new restlessness in her heart? This restlessness which had come to her so suddenly after her meeting with Florrie? Was it true that her youth was slipping from her before she had grasped all the happiness that life offered? Or was it only the stirring of the spring winds, of the young green against the blue sky, of the mating birds, of the roving, provocative scents of flowers, of the checkered light and shade on the grassy strip under the maples? Was it all these things, or was it none of them, that awoke this longing, so vague and yet so unquenchable, in her heart? A car stopped in the street outside, the bell rang, and she watched the figure of a trim mulatto maid flit through the hall to the door. An instant later, Arthur's name was announced, and Gabriella, with her hands in his clasp, stood looking into his face. It had been 18 years since they parted, and in those 18 years she had carried his image like some sacred talisman in her breast. "How little you've changed, Gabriella," he said, after a moment of silence in which she told herself that he was far better looking, far more distinguished than she had remembered him. "You are larger than you used to be, but your face is as girlish as ever." "And I have 2 children, nearly grown," she replied with a trembling little laugh. "A daughter who is already thinking of the white sulphur." They sat down in the pink chairs on the gray carpet and leaned forward, looking into each other's faces as tenderly as they had done when they were lovers. "It's hard to believe it," he answered a little stiffly, in his dry and gentle voice, which held a curious note of finality, of failure. For the first time, while he spoke, she let her eyes rest frankly upon him, and there came to her, as she did so, a vivid realization of the emptiness and aimlessness of his life. He looked handsomer than ever. He looked stately and formal and impressive, but he looked old, though he was only 45. He looked old and ineffectual and acquiescent. The fighting strength, such as it was, had gone out of him, and the stamp of failure was on him, from his high, pale, intellectual forehead, where the fine brown hair had retreated to the crown of his head, to his narrow features and his relaxed, slender limbs, with their slow and indolent movements. He was one of those, she felt intuitively, who had stood aloof from the rewards as well as from the strains of the struggle, who had withered to the core not from age, but from an inherent distrust of all effort, of all endeavor. For his immobility went deeper than any physical habit. It attacked, like an incurable malady, the very fiber and substance of his nature. With his intellect, his training, his traditions, she discerned, with a flash of insight, that he had failed because he lacked the essential faith in the future. He had lost, not because he had risked, but because he had hesitated. Not because he had loved ease, but because he had feared effort. For fear of a misstep, he had not dared to go forward. From dread of pain, he had refused the opportunity of happiness. She knew now why he had never come to her, why he had let her slip from his grasp. All that was a part of his failure, of his distrust of life, of his profound negation of spirit. "Yes, it is hard," she assented, and there came over her like a sudden sense of discomfort, of physical hardship, the knowledge that, in the very beginning, she was trying to make conversation. Meeting his sympathetic smile, the smile that still delighted the impressionable hearts of old ladies, she told herself obstinately, with desperate determination, that she was not disappointed, that he was just as she had remembered him, dear and lovable and kind and conventional. When she recalled what he had been at 27, it appeared inevitable to her that at 45 he should have settled a little more firmly into the mold of the past, that his opinions should have crystallized and imprisoned his mind immovably in the center of them. She told him what she could about Archibald and Fanny, about her choice of schools, her maternal pride in Archibald's intellect and Fanny's appearance, her hopeful plans for the future, and he listened attentively, with his manner of slightly pompous consideration, while he passed one of his long, narrow hands over his forehead. When she had finished her vivacious recital, he began to talk slowly and gravely about himself, with the tolerant and impersonal detachment of one who has reduced life to a gesture, a manner. "I wonder if he has ever really cared about anything, even about me?" she questioned after a minute. But while the thought was still in her mind, he mentioned his mother's name, and it was impossible to doubt the sincerity of his sorrow and his tenderness. "I have seemed only half alive since I lost her," he said, and the words were like a searchlight which flashed over his character and illumined its obscurities. Did his whole attitude of immobility and negation result from the depth and the intensity of his feeling, from the exquisite reticence and sensitiveness of his soul? I know," she murmured in a voice of sympathy. After all, she was not disappointed in him. He was as tender, as chivalrous, as noble as she had believed him to be. The dream was true, and yet, in spite of its truthfulness, it seemed to evaporate slowly while she sat there in Jane's pink satin chair and looked out at the sunlight. Only the restlessness, the inappeasable longing in her heart had not changed. Looking across the hall into the library, she could see the old French mirror reflecting the bronze candelabra, with crystal pendants, and the thought flitted into her brain, "It is all real. I am here, talking to Arthur. It is every bit true." But her words failed to convince her, and she had a curious sensation of vagueness and thinness, as if their low, gentle voices were issuing from shadows. "I should like to show you some of our improvements," he said presently, with a faintly perceptible ripple of animation. "I wonder if you would care to come out in my car. We might go up Monument Avenue into the country." The idea was delightful, she told him, with convincing enthusiasm, and while she ran upstairs to put on her hat, he went out to the car, which was standing in front of the house. So preoccupied was he with his reflections that when Gabriella appeared, he started almost as if he had forgotten that he was waiting for her. The air was as soft and fragrant as summer. The grassy strip under the young maples was diapered with sunlight, and an edge of rosy gold was tinting the far horizon. As they sped up the avenue, Arthur pointed out the houses to her as possessively as Charlie had done the afternoon before, and in the pride with which he told her the cost of them, she recognized an admirable freedom from envy or bitterness. If he had not achieved these things, his attitude seemed to say, it was because he had never been in the race, because he had preferred to stand aside and enjoy the reposeful entertainment of the spectator. The avenue, which swept on indefinitely after the houses had stopped, dwindled at last to 2 straight and narrow walks, binding the town to the country with bands of concrete. The pines had fallen in blackened ruins, and where Gabriella remembered thickets of wildflowers, there were masses of red clay furrowed by cartwheels. "You see, we're developing all this property now," observed Arthur, in a gratified tone, as they whirled past an old field, intersected by a concrete walk, which informed the curious that it was Arlington Avenue. Honeysuckle Lane has gone, too, and we're grading a street there now in front of the old Berkeley place." "The growth has been wonderful," said Gabriella, a little pensively. "But do you remember how lovely Honeysuckle Lane used to be? That's where we went for wild honeysuckle in the spring." "Oh, we'll find plenty of honeysuckle farther out. I gathered a big bunch of it for Cousin Nellie yesterday." For a while they sped on in silence. Arthur was intent on the wheel, and Gabriella could think of nothing to say to him that she had not said in Jane's drawing room. When at last they left the desolation of improvement and came out into the natural country, the sun was already low, and the forest of pines along the glowing horizon was like an impending storm. Once Arthur stopped, and they got out to gather wild honeysuckle by the roadside. Then, with the sticky, heavily scented blossoms in her lap, they went on again toward the sunset, still silent, still separated by an impalpable barrier. "He is just what I thought he would be," she thought sadly. "He is just where I left him 18 years ago, and yet it is different. In some inexplicable way it is different from what I expected." And she told herself that the fault was her own, that she had changed, hardened, and become hopelessly matter-of-fact, that she had lost her youth and her sentiment. Suddenly, as if the action had been forced upon him by the steady pressure of some deep conviction, some inner necessity, Arthur turned his face toward her and asked gently, "Gabriella, do you ever think of the past?" Facing the rosy sunset, his features looked wan and colorless, and she noticed again that he seemed to have dried through and through, like some rare fruit that has lain wrapped in tissue paper too long. She looked at him with wistful and somber eyes. Now that the desired moment had come, she felt only that she would have given her whole future to escape before it overtook her, to avoid the inevitable, crowning hour of her destiny. "I think of it very often," she answered truthfully, while she buried her face in the intoxicating bloom of the honeysuckle. "Do you remember my telling you once that I'd never give you up, that I'd never stop caring?" "Yes, I remember, but oh, Arthur, you mustn't." She sat up with a start, gazing straight ahead into the rose and gold of the afterglow. From the deserted road, winding flat and dun-colored in the soft light, she heard another voice, the strong and buoyant voice of O'Hara, saying, "I'm not the sort to change," and then over again, "I'm not the sort to change." "I suppose it's too late," Arthur went on, with his patient tenderness. "Things usually come too late for me, or else I miss them altogether. That's been the way always. And now—" With his left hand he made a large, slow, commemorative gesture. "You are the best, the kindest—" An urgent desire moved her to stop him before he put into words the feeling she could see in his face. Though she knew that it was but the ghost of a feeling, the habit of a desire, which had become interwoven with his orderly and unchangeable custom of life, she realized nevertheless that its imaginary vividness might cause him great suffering. A vision of what might have been 18 years ago, of their possible marriage, rose before her while she struggled for words. How could her energetic nature have borne with his philosophy of hesitation, her imperative affirmation of life with his denial of effort, her unconquered optimism with his deeply rooted mistrust of happiness? There was beauty in his face, in his ascetic and over-refined features, in his sympathetic smile and his cultured voice. But it was the beauty of resignation, of defeat nobly borne, of a spirit confirmed in the bitter sweetness of renouncement. "It would make an old woman of me to marry him," she thought, "an old, patient, resigned woman." "Most things have slipped by me," he resumed presently, while they raced down a long hill toward the black pines and the fading red of the afterglow. In a marshy pond near the roadside, frogs were croaking, while from the darkening fields, encircled with webs of mist, there floated the mingled scents of freshly mown grass, of dewy flowers, of trodden weeds, of plowed earth, of ancient mold, all the fugitive and immemorially suggested odors of the country at twilight. And at the touch of these scents, some unforgotten longing seemed to stir in her brain as if it had slept there, covered by clustering memories from another lifetime. She wanted something with an unbearable intensity. The vague and elusive yearning for happiness had become suddenly poignant and definite. In that instant she knew unerringly that she was in love not with a dream, but with a fact, that she was in love not with Arthur, but with O'Hara. For days, weeks, months, she had been blindly groping toward the knowledge, and now, in a flash of intuition, it had come to her like one of those discoveries of science which baffle investigators for years and then miraculously reveal themselves in a moment of insight. Her first antagonism, her injustice, her unreasonable resentments and suspicions, she recognized now, in the piercing light of this discovery, as the inexplicable disguises of love. And she was not old, she was not even middle-aged. She was as young as Fanny, as young as the eternal, ageless spirit of romance, of adventure. This was life in her pulses, in her brain, in her heart. Life, not pale, not bittersweet, but sparkling, glowing, bubbling like wine. At the foot of the long hill, Arthur turned the car, and they flew back between the dim fields, where the croaking of frogs sounded louder in the darkness. Ahead of them, the lights of the car flitted like golden moths over the dust of the road, and in the sky, beyond the thin veil of mist, the stars were shining over the city. Spring, which possessed the earth, bloomed in Gabriella's heart with a wonderful color, a wonderful fragrance. She was young again, with the imperishable youth of magic, of enchantment. To love, to hope, to strive, this was both romance and adventure. "It is too late then, Gabriella?" asked Arthur, after a long silence, and in his voice there was the sound of suffering acquiescence. "I'm afraid it is, dear Arthur," she answered softly, and they did not speak again until the lights blazed over them, and they ran into Monument Avenue. After all, it was too late. What could she have added to the answer she had given him? When they reached the house, he did not come in with her, and tears stained her face while she went slowly up the steps, and stood beside Jane's hydrangeas, with her hand on the bell. Then, as the door opened quickly, she saw her mother waiting with an eager, expectant look at the door of the library, and heard her excited voice murmur, "Well, dear?" "We had a lovely drive, Mother. Arthur is just as I remembered him, except that he has grown so much older." A disappointed expression crossed Mrs. Carr's face. "Is that all?" she asked regretfully. Gabriella laughed happily. "That is all. Only I found out exactly what I wanted to know." For the rest of the week she devoted herself to her mother with a solicitude which aroused in the brain of that melancholy lady serious apprehensions of a hastening decline, and when her visit was over, she packed her trunks with girlish, delicious thrills of happiness and started back to New York. "Do you really think I am failing so rapidly, Gabriella?" Mrs. Carr inquired anxiously, while they waited for the train on the platform of the upper station. "Failing? Why, no, Mother. You look splendidly," Gabriella assured her, a little surprised, a little startled. "Why should you ask me such a thing?" "Oh, nothing, dear. I had a fancy," murmured Mrs. Carr meekly. And then, as the train rushed into view, she kissed her daughter reproachfully, and stood gazing after her until the last coach and the last white jacket of the dining car attendants vanished in the smoky sunshine of the distance. Through the long day, lying back in her chair, with her eyes on the flying green landscape, Gabriella thought of the discovery she had made while she was driving with Arthur. The restlessness, the uncertainty, the vague yet poignant longing for an indefinite good had passed out of her happy and exultant heart. In obedience to the law of her nature, which decreed that she should move swiftly and directly toward the end of her destiny, she was returning to O'Hara as resolutely, as unswervingly, as she had fled from him. It's strange how little I've ever understood, how little I've ever known myself, she thought, staring vacantly at a severe spinster with crimped hair and a soured expression, who sat before the opposite window. I've gone on in the dark, making mistakes and discoveries from the very beginning, undoing and doing over again, creating illusions and then destroying them, always moving, always changing, always growing in new directions. A year ago, I'd have laughed at the idea that I could love any man but Arthur, that of all men I could love Ben O'Hara. And today, I know that he is the future for me, that he is the beginning again of my youth. A year ago, I thought only how I might change him, how I might make him over. And now I realize that I shall never change him, that I shall never make him over, and that it doesn't really matter. It isn't the vital thing. The vital thing is character, and I wouldn't change that if I could. For the rest, I shall probably always wish him different in some ways, just as I wish myself different. I'd like to have him more like Arthur on the surface, just as I'd like to have myself more like Fanny. I'd like to give him Arthur's manner, just as I'd like to give myself Fanny's complexion. But it isn't possible. He will always be what he is now, and after all, it is what he is. It is not something else that I want. With a glimmer of the clairvoyant insight which had come to her on the country road, she understood that O'Hara was for her an embodied symbol of life, that she must either take him or leave him, completely and without reserve or evasion. He was not an ideal. In the love she felt for him, there was none of the sentimental glamour of her passion for George. She saw his imperfections, but she saw that the man was bigger than any attributes, that his faults were as nothing compared to the abundance of his virtues, and that, perfect or imperfect, the tremendous fact remained that she loved him. In the opposite chair, the severe spinster had taken a strip of knitted silk out of her bag, and was working industriously on a man's necktie of blue and gray. From her intent and preoccupied look, from the nervous twitching of her thin lips, the close peering of her nearsighted eyes, through rimless glasses, which she wore attached by a gold chain to her hair, she might have found in the act of knitting a supreme consolation for the inexorable denials of destiny. I wonder if it satisfies her, just knitting, thought Gabriella. Has she submitted like Arthur to chance, to the way things happen when one no longer resists? Is she really contented merely to knit, or is she knitting as a condemned prisoner might knit while he is waiting for the scaffold? And while she watched the patient fingers, she added, "One must either conquer or be conquered, and I will never be conquered." It was 8 o'clock when she reached New York, and as she drove the short distance to West 23rd Street, she began to wonder when she should see O'Hara, and what she should say to him. In the end, she decided that she would wait for a chance meeting, that she would let it happen when it would without moving a step or lifting a hand. Before many days they would be obliged to meet in the yard or the hall, and some obscure, consecrated tradition of sex, some secret strain of her mother's ineradicable feminine instinct, oppose the direct and sensible way. As soon as I meet him, and in the end I shall surely meet him, everything will be all right, she thought, with her eyes on the streets where the spring multitude of children were swarming. And from this multitude of children of young, ardent, and adventurous life, there seemed to emanate a colossal and irresistible will, the will to be, to live, to love, to create, and to conquer. The taxicab turned swiftly into 23rd Street, and while it stopped beside the pavement, she saw that Mrs. Squires was standing, with her arms on the gate, staring into the street. As Gabriella alighted, the woman came forward and said with suppressed emotion, while she wiped her eyes on the back of her hand, "You came just a minute too late to say goodbye to Mr. O'Hara." "Goodbye? But where has he gone?" "He has gone to Washington tonight. Tomorrow he is starting to the west." "When is he coming back? Did he tell you?" At this, Mrs. Squires broke down. "He ain't ever coming back. That's what I'm crying for. He's given up his rooms, and his furniture all went to the auction yesterday. He says he's going to live out in Colorado or Wyoming for the rest of his life, and he didn't even tell me where I could write to him. It's a great loss to me, Mrs. Carr. I'd got used to him and his ways, and when you've once got used to a man, it ain't easy to give him up." She sobbed audibly as she finished, and it seemed to Gabriella that a lifetime of experience passed in the instant while she stood there, with her pulses drumming in her ears, her throat contracting until she struggled for breath, and the lights of the city swimming in a nebulous blur before her eyes. Yet in that instant, as in every crisis of her life, she turned instinctively to action, to movement, to exertion, however futile. While she walked across the pavement to the waiting cab, for the crowning and ultimate choice of her life, she abandoned forever the authority and guide of tradition. Tradition, she knew, bade her sit and wait on destiny until she withered, like Arthur, to the vital core of her nature. But something mightier than tradition, something which she shared with the swarming multitude of children in the streets, the will to live, to strive, and to conquer. This had risen superior to the empty rules of the past. With her hand on the door of the taxicab, she spoke rapidly to the driver. "Drive back to the station as fast as you can. There is not a minute to lose." When the cab started, she leaned forward, with her hands clasped on her knees, and her eyes on the street where the children were playing. Because of the children, they drove very slowly, and once, when the traffic held them up for a few minutes, she felt an impulse to scream. Suppose she missed him after all. Suppose she lost him in the station. Suppose she never saw him again. And besides this, possibly it seemed to her that all the other suffering of her life, George's desertion, her humiliation, her struggle to make a living for her children, the loneliness of the long summers, her poverty and hunger and self-denial, that all these things were merely superficial annoyances. "If we don't go on, I shall die," she said aloud suddenly. "If we don't go on, I shall die." And when at last the cab started again, she heard the words like an undercurrent beneath the innumerable noises of the street. "If we don't go on, I shall die." The taxicab stopped. A porter ran forward to take her bag, and while she thrust the money into the driver's hand, she heard her voice coolly and calmly giving directions. "I must catch the next train to Washington." "Have you got your ticket, miss?" She stared back at him blankly. Though she saw his lips moving, it was impossible for her to distinguish the words, because she was still hearing in a muffled undercurrent the roar of the streets. "Have you got your ticket?" They were passing through the station now, and he explained hurriedly, "You can't go through the gate without a ticket." She drew out her purse, and panic seized her afresh while she waited before the window, behind a bald-headed man who counted his change twice before he would move aside and let her step into his place. Then, when the ticket was given to her, she turned and ran after the porter through the gate and down the steps to the platform. As she ran, her eyes wavered to the long platform and the little groups gathered beside the waiting train, which seemed to shake like a moving black-and-white picture. "Suppose I miss him after all. Suppose I never see him again," she thought. and all that was young in her, all that was vital and alive, strained forward as her feet touched the platform. Except for several colored porters and a woman holding a child by the hand, the place was deserted. Then a man stepped quickly out of one of the last coaches, and by his bigness and the red of his hair, she knew that it was O'Hara. At the first sight of him, the panic died suddenly in her heart, and the old peace, the old sense of security and protection, swept over her. Her face, which had been lowered, was lifted like a flower that revives, and her feet, which had stumbled, became the swift flying feet of a girl. It was as if both her spirit and her body sprang toward him. At the sound of his name, he turned and stood motionless, as if hardly believing his vision. "I came back because I couldn't help it," she said. But he was always hard to convince, and he waited now, still transfixed, still incredulous. "I came back because I wanted you more than anything else," she added. "You came back to me?" he asked slowly, as if doubting her. "I came back to you. I wanted you," she repeated. And her voice did not quaver, her eyes did not drop from his questioning gaze. It was all so simple at last. It was all as natural as the joyous beating of her heart. "And you'll marry me now? Tonight?" It was the ultimate test, she knew. The test not only of her love for O'Hara, but of her strength, her firmness, her courage, and of her belief in life. The choice was hers that comes to all men and women sooner or later. The choice between action and inaction, between endeavor and relinquishment, between affirmation and denial, between adventure and deliberation, between youth and age. One thought only made her hesitate, and she almost whispered the words, "But the children." He laughed softly. "Oh, the children are always there. We're not quitters." And in a graver tone, he asked for the second time, "Will you come with me now, tonight, Gabriella?" At the repeated question, she stretched out her hands, while she watched the light break on his face. "I'll come with you now, anywhere, toward the future," she answered. End of section 34. End of Life and Gabriella, The Story of a Woman's Courage, by Ellen Glasgow. Recording by Nancy Halper, Summit, New Jersey.